So welcome everyone to this webinar. So this webinar is on climate-related financial disclosures, and we are running this event as part of a series of events we're doing for London Climate Action Week. We've been doing sessions on greening pensions, on how to operate green fleets. We did a really interesting session on how to build in sustainability into consumer marketing and consumer messaging to promote that adoption of sustainable technology. And we've also been running an event on the race to zero and kind of what companies are expected to do if they want to be part of that. This really is part of our efforts to really help Tech UK members improve and upskill themselves in all aspects of climate strategy. So looking at kind of all your emissions, kind of pathways to decarbonisation, and obviously kind of keeping a bit more informed on the regulatory and policy developments that are taking place. And I think this one probably sits in that bucket. So as you'll probably know, the UK has recently consulted on plans for all large companies and LLPs and large asset holders as well. They're going to be mandating that all companies, firms publish climate-related disclosures in their annual reports and financial statements. This has been bubbling up for a while now, and it's kind of the direct response to sort of ESG-minded investors and stakeholders kind of calling for companies to be more kind of explicit about the risks and probably the opportunities as well that sort of climate change is actually having on them, and allowing the investing community to kind of not only hold companies more accountable, but actually understand businesses' exposure to climate risk. I think this has been done at kind of international level. I think the OECD have pushed it. I know Mark Carney's Global Task Force has been pushing for TCFD for a while, and I think France are making it mandatory too. But we've also seen kind of the G7. They are the leaders of the G7 back mandatory disclosures, and we saw the kind of communique from the finance ministers there. And again, this is kind of part of the kind of really needing more kind of harmonization of approaches across the world. So to help our members really understand kind of what this means for them, what the policy looks like, and really trying to get their heads around kind of how to implement this, we've got three really good speakers today. So we've got Benjamin Fagan-Watson. He's a senior policy advisor at BEIS. So he's covering TCFD and the green finance policy, and we'll kind of talk through the consultation that they did on this, and that obviously Tech UK has responded to, and others. So we'll be taking from the kind of policy and what the UK government expects businesses to do. Obviously, this is an emerging step, so it'll be really useful to hear the next steps as well, what it means for businesses kind of following the consultation closing, and obviously the government publishing its formal response, presumably in the autumn. But then we've got Helena Nathan-King. She's a senior consultant at EcoAct, which is part of Atos, which really helps kind of companies with their sustainability. And to give that kind of in-house perspective, we've got the one and only Andy Murray. He's taking a break from Senate Court. Sorry, you've probably had that too many times ever. But no, he's environment manager at Vodafone and can really tell you what it means and kind of how a large business like Vodafone is going to be implementing these rules and making these disclosures. So without further ado, I was going to get started with Ben. So bear with me one sec while I bring up your slide deck. And well, like I say, a bit of housekeeping actually. If you could keep yourselves on mute when the presenters are speaking, and I know Ben can take questions throughout, but I think in the interest of time, let's try to save all the questions to the end when you've seen all the presentations. So if you do have a question for any of the individual speakers, let's probably keep that to the end, and we can debate the last portion of time, for Q&A. Just so obviously we only got 1 hour. So if you want to ask a question, you can either raise your hand, put it in the chat, or you can basically just ask it vocally over the call. So I'm going to put myself on mute. I'm going to load up the slides from Ben, and over to Ben.
Thanks very much. So hello everyone, my name is Ben Fagan-Watson. I'm a senior policy officer in the Green Finance team in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and I lead on TCFD policy and also on other aspects of green finance like the green taxonomy, which we're working on. Please do let me know if you can't hear me properly. I am attempting to keep an eye on the chat as well, although that has just disappeared with Craig bringing things up. I'm doing this. No, it's all right. I'm doing this through my browser as well, so apologies if this isn't terribly smooth. Okay, right, let's take it away. So I'll provide some general overarching context and then talk about our specific proposals on TCFD. So the UK has committed to net zero in 2050. We're hosting the COP26 climate negotiations in November, and here you can see the Prime Minister talking about some of his ambitions for the business community. So this is a big year for climate change. On to the next slide, please. Good luck, Chris Whitty. For context, the UK has decarbonised faster than the rest of the G7, while also growing GDP faster. As you can see from the graph on the right, though, a substantial amount of those reductions have been in the power and utility sector, and also in business and industry and in natural resources. And so there's still a lot of work to do here. On to the next slide, please. Last year, the Prime Minister published his 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, which was quite a landmark publication and included some commitments on TCFD, and also has paved the way for further publications. So we're expecting to publish a net zero strategy in the autumn as well, which will build on this. I'll go into what the content of this 10-point plan is, though, but it's worth a quick flick through if you haven't read it. On to the next slide. So the 10-point plan has lots of sector-specific chapters about nuclear or hydrogen or offshore wind and things like that. And then also some of the enablers which we need to reach net zero. So the final chapter is about green finance and innovation, which is my turf, about what we need to do in those spaces to kind of make the rest of the system shift. On to the next slide, please. So there's a variety of things in that chapter about greenhouse gas removal technology and energy storage and things like that in terms of encouraging innovation. On the green finance side, interestingly, it was talking about the UK's first sovereign green bond, which will come out later this year. I think Treasury's committed to a substantial bond programme financing government's green activities. And also, crucially for this conversation, it said that we would mandate climate-related financial disclosures across the economy by 2025, with many of those measures in place by 2023. On to the next slide, please. Oh, that slide has totally broken. Okay, so what this was supposed to show was that there's been a kind of pathway here from the Climate Change Act in 2008 through to the Green Finance Task Force, which published its recommendations in 2018. The government then responded by publishing its Green Finance Strategy in 2019. In November last year, we had the 10-point plan and also the Chancellor's statement on the future of financial services, which is also worth a look through because it includes reference to mandating TCFD across the economy, but also, for example, putting in place a green taxonomy, which will be a way of classifying what is a sustainable economic activity. Things that are coming up are we're hosting the climate negotiations, obviously, in November. And next year, the picture on the right-hand side is supposed to represent that we are putting out a revamped version of the Green Finance Strategy, Green Finance Strategy version 2 in 2022. On to the next slide, please.
Oh, sorry, I think it was meant to be...
Don't worry, that's the rest of the slide. Totally fine. So what is TCFD for those who aren't familiar? The TCFD is a set of international recommendations about how organisations, not just companies, but financial organisations, pension funds, others like that, can disclose what their climate-related risks and opportunities are. It has 4 pillars. It's got the governance pillar, what's the structures you've got internally for dealing with climate change, strategy, how you're incorporating climate change risks and opportunities into your strategy, and there's a section there on scenario analysis, so looking to the future. How do you look at future scenarios and incorporate those into your business models, both those where there is substantial amounts of climate change and those where government and others act to kind of decarbonise the economy more quickly. Risk management, about how you incorporate climate change into your risk management processes, and then key metrics and targets, which you disclose. On to the next slide, please. So now this is into the specific bits about what we're actually proposing. We came forward with a consultation in March on using powers that we have under the Companies Act 2006 and the Limited Liabilities Partnership 2000 to require climate-related financial disclosures. So within a company's annual report and accounts, companies will have to disclose those key elements, their governance, their strategy, their risk management, their metrics and targets, how they're planning to deal with risks and opportunities from climate change, and how they kind of envisage that impacting on their strategy. And we are going to, subject to parliamentary approval and further policy making and so on, do this via a statutory instrument, which is secondary legislation. So we lay that in Parliament, and then after debate and when it's passed by Parliament, after about 6 to 7 weeks, it will come into force. We have planned for the regulations to kick in on what we're encouraged to use common commencement dates in government. There are two. There's the 6th of April and the 1st of October. And we are planning for our regulations to come into force on the 6th of April, so 2022. So any company or LLP which is within scope of our regulations will have to prepare climate-related financial disclosures for financial years beginning on or after the 6th of April 2022 through to 5th of March 2023. It's also worth noting this is part of a wider push. So the Financial Conduct Authority has already put in place a listing rule for premium listed companies which have to comply or explain about how they're complying with the TCFD regulations. They've now recently put out a proposal saying they're planning to extend that to standard listed companies as well, so all listed companies. They've also putting out consultations on how they think asset managers and FCA regulated pension funds and others should disclose. The Department for Work and Pensions has also brought forward legislation which they recently laid in Parliament, which will require occupational pension schemes to make disclosures from 2023. So this is kind of an economy-wide measure where we're putting in place most of them, and the idea is that many of them we're kind of ramping them up and expanding them out, and so that we'll be covering the whole economy by 2025. As you said in your introduction earlier, this is world leading, but we've also secured agreement at the G7 finance ministers meeting that the G7 are going to also require climate related financial disclosures across their economy. So we're going first, but we are by no means the only ones. On to the next slide, please. So in terms of the scope of who's captured, there's a term which is public interest entities, which is those who are listed and traded, banks, insurers, and those sorts of organisations. Any of those which have more than 500 employees will be in scope of our regulations. Companies which are registered on AIM with more than 500 employees, and then private companies and limited liability partnerships which have more than 500 employees and more than £500 million turnover will also be in scope. On to the next slide, please. So what will they actually have to do? This was our proposals in terms of what companies will have to disclose against. We proposed that companies would disclose against the 4 headline pillars of TCFD, although there were questions in the consultation about whether or not that should extend down to the 11 specific recommendations of TCFD. So here you're talking about who's in charge of dealing with climate change and has operational responsibility for it, whether the audit committee is considering it, how this is integrated into a company's strategy, how you're incorporating climate change into your risk management, and the KPIs and metrics that you're using to manage climate change. Now, it's worth saying that many of these companies, so public interest entities, for example, already have to produce within their strategic report and their annual report and accounts a list of the key of their strategy and their key risks and their KPIs already. And so we're slotting this into that section, and there was quite strong feedback in favour of that at the consultation, that the strategic report is the right place because it's kind of coherent with the content there, but with a specific focus on climate change. On to the next slide, please. Our consultation closed on the 5th of May. We're now considering feedback, and we will be publishing our response towards the end of the year. And as I said, we anticipate that the regulations will come into force from the 6th of April. It's not on these slides, but something that also may be of interest to Tech UK members is that I mentioned the green taxonomy earlier. Yesterday, the Chancellor of the Exchequer made his Mansion House speech where he stated that the UK is going to roll out an integrated sustainable disclosures regime, of which the taxonomy will be a key element. And there's a supporting document published as well. So that would be worth looking at too. So I think it's worth saying that if these proposals go through and subject to parliamentary scrutiny and et cetera, the entire landscape for sustainable disclosures is changing for companies going forward. The TCFD regulations we propose to roll out across the economy by 2025. We're also proposing to put in place a green taxonomy as part of a wider integrated sustainable disclosures regime. And we've also, UK government, along with several regulators, put out a supportive statement about international sustainability standards, which are being developed by the IFRS, saying we're strongly in favour of these standards. Obviously, we have to see what they look like and whether they're appropriate to the UK and establish a mechanism by which we'd bring them in. But in the future, we would be looking at whether it would be appropriate to bring in those international sustainability standards as well. So there's a lot of change here. I think this will be of interest to Tech UK members, both in terms of compliance. I'm sure many of you will be subject to this regime and will have to disclose how you're dealing with climate change and incorporating it into your business strategy. I suppose there's also quite a lot of opportunities here in terms of providing that information from companies to investors and data scraping and other things like that to inform financial institutions, so that the information from companies is flowing up and down the investment chain to asset managers and to the ultimate asset owners like pension funds about what the climate risks are that companies perceive they're subject to and how they're planning to manage them. So hopefully that's interesting. Oh, I've had one question. For a company that has their financial year aligned with the calendar year, so the regulations come into force on the 6th of April 2022. So if your financial year starts on the 1st of January, your year 1st of January 2023 to 31st of December 2023 would be subject to these regulations. So you don't do it for the 2022 year, you do it for the 2023 year. And obviously you get a couple months grace to file your accounts after then, but we'd expect to see a report from a company like that emerging in early 2024. Happy to take any other quick factual questions or anything like that. Or we can save up for the Q&A at the end.
Thanks, Ben. That was really good. I think we have time. We have a few minutes. If anyone has a couple of very quick questions, otherwise we can save that to the end. Cool. And I should say, actually, we have no questions. I should say, for the benefit of those who have joined since we started, this session is actually being recorded and we'll be putting it on the Tech UK Climate Hub and obviously sharing it with those who registered to attend today. But yeah, no questions, we'll save it to the end. So thanks, Ben. Really useful, really good. I'm now going to go over to Helena Nathan King from EcoAct. I'm just going to fire up your slides. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Craig. Hi, everyone. So my name is Helena Nathan King. I'm a senior consultant at EcoAct, an Atos company, and I lead on our climate risk scenario analysis and TCFD service areas. So today I'm going to first go through sort of the main trends that we've seen through working with our clients, but then also give a bit more insight into what we feel is sort of important towards TCFD alignment, focusing particularly on the identification of risks and opportunities in climate change and the use of climate scenario analysis to enable that alignment. So next slide, please. So in terms of the trends that we've seen, we're definitely finding that our clients are reacting to the mandatory reporting being laid out by the UK government, but also beyond as well. So recently in the US, an executive order from Joe Biden, but then also its investors as well. So this is a quote from Larry Fink's letters to CEOs from January this year, which actually makes the link to COVID and how the impact of the pandemic has ultimately given us a bit of a reminder of how fragile we really are to these global impacts. And that's actually what we've definitely been seeing in sort of weirdly in response to the pandemic. There seems to be more of an awareness or appreciation of how, you know, these big impact global risks are tangible, they do happen. So as we focus moving towards building back better out of the pandemic, we really are seeing that investors are considering risk and thinking about the long-term viability and sustainability of business as a whole. And TCFD really supports this vision. So the mandatory reporting couldn't really have come at a better time. Next slide, please. So this slide just summarizes some of the research that we do at EcoAct each year. So every year we do a review of the FTSE 100 and several other indices and how those companies are reporting relating to sustainability. So it's our sustainability reporting performance research. And this data shows the trends that we've found over the last few years on TCFD alignment and the use of climate scenario analysis. In 2018, we saw that 15% of the FTSE 100 were aligning to the TCFD, and this rose to 56% in 2020. And we only expect this to increase even more for when we publish our next research in October for 2021. Of those reporting companies, 42% already use climate scenario analysis. However, there's a lot of variability in approaches and an appreciation of the fact that it's not a finished piece of work through reporting. Next slide, please. So I think really found is that TCFD allows you to demonstrate the long-term resilience of the organization in the face of climate change to investors or other third parties, regardless of the warming scenario. So TCFD shouldn't be just considered a one-stop shop reporting exercise, although the reporting is really, really important and it is needed to demonstrate progress. We really see it as being something that should be embedded into how the organization runs. So this is why we use scenario analysis to really understand what the potential future scenarios could look like for the reporting organization. These scenarios tend to have already been defined by the scientific literature. And for scenario analysis, you look at least to a high carbon scenario, which would lead to a sort of business as usual 4 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. And this would be where you see the increasing physical risks associated with climate change. However, we also need to look at that low carbon transition pathway. So looking at that 1.5, well below 2 degrees scenario, where we would see the increasing transition risks and opportunities from climate change. However, within that low carbon pathway, we should also be reminded that, as was announced in the Climate Change Committee's reports recently, that some of that warming has already occurred. It's what they've referred to as being baked in. So there will be still some physical impacts from climate change that we need to be aware of. So ultimately, this is why it's really important for this to be treated as a long-term exercise. We don't know what's going to happen. We just need to have an understanding of what the potential possible scenarios could be. It needs to be long-term. The climate science will continue to evolve. So it's important that climate scenario analysis as part of TCFD becomes fully embedded into your risk processes so it can be continually reviewed over time. Next slide, please. So the main questions that we've had on climate scenario analysis and TCFD is how do we do it? What's the scenarios we should choose? Should we be doing a quantitative or qualitative approach? And what we've really found is that actually we need to first take a step back. And where we've seen the value is through stakeholder engagements throughout the value chain, beyond the sustainability team, beyond the leadership team, to really understand what the potential impacts of climate change could be from the business's perspective. And this is important because in order to determine which scenarios you want to be using, you need to have some idea of what potential risks or opportunities could be material to your organization. Because it's about changing how the business itself is run, we need to really understand the mindsets, preparedness, and future adaptive capacity across the organization before looking at those scenarios. So overall, we really see it as a process of capacity building, understanding over time what those trends could be and starting to sort of embed that into the way the business operates. At EcoAct, we do this through a series of interviews and workshops before we get to the scenario modeling, which basically enables us to apply effectively a climate lens to the stakeholders of that organization, based on what they already know and understand about what they do. So this really is about sort of marrying what's already happening, what the current strategy is, and applying climate change to that perspective. Overall, this then helps to determine how the scenario modeling itself should be approached, including which scenarios, the appropriate methodologies, time horizons, etc. Capacity building through this approach really is part of the process. It shouldn't be done in one go. Again, it's a long-term piece of work, and it's really something that needs to be fully sort of embedded and understood by the organization. And it's something that over time you can continue to develop and improve on, because it's definitely not seen as a sort of a quick fix. There's still a lot of variability in the data available out there for doing this kind of analysis. So it should be something that's continually looked at over time. Next slide, please. Thank you. So over time, we will expect that companies and organizations will become more used to it, and start building in that sort of risk identification and adaptation, mitigation strategies against those risks and opportunities. And over time, we'll actually realize that there is quite a lot of upside in the face of climate change as well. I think this is really neatly summarized by Mark Carney from 2019, where he emphasizes that the firms that align their business models to a transition to a net zero world will be rewarded handsomely. However, those that fail to adapt will cease to exist. So there really is a link with net zero and the strategy that the government has set out to reduce those emissions, and also ensuring sort of resilience along that pathway and demonstrating to your investors that there is resilience there and you understand what the potential eventualities could be. So overall, TCFD should not be considered as a one-stop shop reporting exercise. It shouldn't be sort of limited in that way, but companies really and organizations should be really aiming to embed the philosophy of TCFD and using climate scenario analysis as a tool to continually adapt how you're running your organization. And this will ultimately help to reap the rewards and support building back better in response to the pandemic as well. So that's everything from me. I'm happy to take questions now, or can wait till the end, Craig, whatever's easiest for you.
No, that was really good. No, I think that was very good. Thank you. Yes, if anyone has any questions, or we can see them. Hello. Okay, there's not. I'm going to, final speaker is Andy Murray from Vodafone. So yeah, Vodafone are, very large telco and IT services firm. And I think it'd be really valuable to hear from Andy on the sort of in-house element of this. So he's got to, actually worry about implementing this. So bear with me a sec while I sort of load up your presentation. It's easier if I just share my screen. Yeah, and over to Andy.
Great, thanks, Craig. And yes, hi everyone. Great to be here. And yeah, really interesting couple of presentations there from Ben and Helena. It's a really interesting topic of the last 2 or 3 years, TCFD, and it's definitely moving rapidly. And we've found that within Vodafone. I'm Andy Murray. I sit in the group sustainable business team. I'm the senior environment manager, so I kind of have a lot of ownership of what we call our planet pillar of our purpose, which is where kind of climate change and carbon sits. I'd hope most people know Vodafone. Predominantly kind of in a UK perspective, we're one of the the mobile and fixed broadband operators here, but we have a global footprint. So operate right across Europe and have another kind of large presence across the African continent, as well as joint ventures further beyond. So in terms of climate, we've got a huge range of challenges, of markets we operate in, and potential kind of risks and opportunities that we have to consider within our business model. On the next slide, just a few of our kind of targets, and this fits really well with Helena's last slide, that, yeah, you know, climate change risk, but it's also an opportunity. And, you know, TCFD doesn't sit in isolation. It's part of a trend and a program of action. And there's a real potential to use TCFD to build and support other parts of your business. You know, most notably, you know, the kind of planet targets here, kind of net zero and reducing your carbon emissions and reducing those risks from climate. But also, you'll see in here, there's a target for what we call enablement. How can we support our customers to reduce their carbon emissions? And we've got a target for 350 million tons, which is about the size of Italy's carbon emissions. Now, that for us is a massive opportunity. So there's not just risks, there's also potential for business there. You know, we can provide solutions to help others reduce their risk and manage their carbon. Now, you know, why are we doing all this? On the next slide, yeah, as you'll see and heard earlier from Ben, you know, there's a legal requirement. You know, TCFD is going to be required in our annual reporting. You know, it's impacting us as a group in the UK where we're headquartered, but also a number of our markets also do their local reporting and have local increasing requirements around this topic. And then likewise, you know, mirroring the earlier presentation, you know, one of the main stakeholders is our investors, who are demanding action on climate change and on TCFD reporting, so they can get a better feel for how we're performing as a company and what we're doing. On the next slide, you'll see that if we kind of think a little bit beyond TCFD, there's a wider list of stakeholders. If we move forward one slide, here we go, which is, it builds into that wider climate narrative. So our investors are probably the principal stakeholders and kind of policymakers who want to see what we're doing, how we're supporting the global effort on climate change. But our consumers are increasingly aware of green topics, increasingly demanding we take action, and there's quite a lot of risk if we don't. And kind of a reputational risk for a company like Vodafone is a significant risk. And if that's now linked to climate change and being seen to be a negative rather than a positive, that's quite significant. And then likewise, our corporate customers, they have their own climate risks, opportunities, targets, agendas. And we need to be able to support them and fit with their expectations on a company like Vodafone. On the next slide, you'll see the kind of the timeline. And for most of us to be aware that kind of TCFD has had one of the most rapid adoptions I've known in the kind of climate and carbon world. If you compare it to, say, CDP, which is a very slow kind of growth, or, you know, RE100 and things like this, TCFD seems to come out of nowhere. And now it's, you know, it's mandatory. And as we saw already last year, half of the FTSE were reporting to it, probably jumping much higher this year. Which is a really positive thing within the global climate action world. But it does mean that, you know, we're all having to work very hard to try and meet these rapid timelines. Vodafone, we're kind of on stage. We just finished our kind of stage 4 of a 5-stage kind of plan to reach full TCFD reporting kind of. It's not compliance, but alignment with the recommendations, and we'll see exactly what the legal requirements are when that's published. But it has taken years, you know, since TCFD really came out in 2017. You know, we started work in, you know, 2018, 2019 on gap analysis, understand what it is for us, and then it's been a progressive series of engagements, projects, work streams to do a kind of group level assessment, and then start to dive down into those local climate risks and opportunities. Because of course, what is true in the UK is very different than our operations, say, in South Africa. So we need to understand these nuances and start to do that scenario-based risk and opportunity analysis, as well as complementary at the same time, embedding that into the processes, engaging across our company, having all these stakeholders involved. So it is a lot of work. And I think the push is there from all of our key stakeholders, as earlier mentioned. And it's just how we utilize it and embrace it within Vodafone and get the maximum benefit out of it, and not see it as another financial reporting burden along with everything else, but actually as a process to make our business stronger, really maximize those opportunities while minimizing our risks. Now, where we are most recently, on the next slide, you'll see our kind of screenshots of some of our most recent disclosures. Our annual report came out last month, and it's an integrated annual report with all of our sustainability disclosures in there. And likewise, we integrated TCFD within our annual report. We tried to keep the annual report concise, because these things already run onto too many pages, and then provide the kind of the key information in there, while also providing much more granular data in a ESG addendum, which really dives into our carbon, energy, risk, social, environmental, and governance kind of data points for those stakeholders that want it. And then we also did this year a standalone TCFD report, which we think is quite a good way of engaging those key stakeholders that really want to understand and see where we are on that journey. And it is a journey. Once we finish this year's kind of work stream, we're not finished. It's in a continual process, and we'll continue to refine our assessments, our disclosures, how we talk about TCFD and how we use it. So yeah, if you really want to know kind of what we've done and where we're at, then please just search TCFD report Vodafone Group, and it'll come up. And it's a manageable size. It's about 20 pages, and it's a nice, easier read to kind of see where we are. Now, if I move on to the next slide, it kind of speaks a bit to kind of what I was saying around, we don't just want to disclose for the sake of it. Yeah, that's great, and we'll have some ESG investors will tick a box in some rating system. But actually what we want to do is engage right across our community. We want to work with our risk people, with our finance people, with our business development people on climate, use it to embed that kind of scenario analysis that we've done, use it to build and integrate into the existing processes to strengthen our company and make sure we're really ready for the rapidly changing kind of situation we're going to find ourselves in, be it regulatory changes or physical changes due to the kind of ever-changing climate and its place in wider society. And then we've got to actually do it, put it into our business, and then report on it. So I think that the TCFD report this year was a really good first step there, and we're really learning and using that to move forward. If we move on to the next slide, there's a few learnings and points, and how we've used TCFD and tried to engage it. And one of the first ones is, prior to TCFD, 3-4 years ago, risks sat over here, sustainability sat here, finance sat here. They all spoke a slightly different language. They all had different approaches. We weren't aligned. So it's a great opportunity to collaborate and really kind of get different people into a room and talk about things, have a common language and a common output. It also, TCFD as a phrase is recognized. So you can speak to certain senior leaders or certain people who have power within your organization. And if you kind of link it to something they know, they will be much more willing to, say, provide budget or time or support, because they understand it's an important thing. It's both important to stakeholders and regulatory. So it's really good for driving those actions and really trying to getting that conversation going, which we might have struggled with in other ways. Again, it shows where your risks and your commercial opportunities are. So you can use it to differentiate. And we all know that, green is going to be one of the drivers of growth moving forwards. So how do you maximize that? How do you minimize your risks, which is just good business, and how do you really identify and push your opportunities? If anyone that reports to CDP and things like this, we all know TCFD has been well embedded in these rating systems, very early on. So there's a lot of companies who even before it was mandatory, it was basically a mandatory disclosure if they wanted to perform well. But also there's kind of, the wider ESG ratings and nuance, which is developing. The finance industry and everyone else are really doubling down on and building their knowledge and understanding. And I think having a good TCFD approach and report will really help that. And then finally, for governance, good governance makes it a good company. It's been known for a long time. And if this can help strengthen that case that some of these topics need to be put into your governance structures, then it's a really useful thing to do. And if you go to the next slide, there's a few more less kind of tangible, more kind of softer actions, which are around kind of climate change as a whole agenda, because TCFD shouldn't be isolated. It should be built into all these different areas. And there's the kind of talent pipeline, there's the staff, there's your reputation, that really kind of, you need to be seen as a good company. And if you can actually use your TCFD to analyze in a quantitative and qualitative way and talk about it in a way that people understand, and the actions you're doing to reduce that, it really does pay dividends in some of these less financial measures. And then finally, if you are looking at finance, a couple of years ago, we launched a green bond, and it was great. It oversold 750 million euros worth of specific finance for green initiatives. We reported on how we spent that and the carbon savings from it. And again, that's an increasing trend. People are going from green bonds now to kind of ESG and social bonds and things as well. And then there's your kind of your insurance costs, which will hopefully go down if you can show you're managing your risks better. And then there's bid winning. It's a common question in a number of these potential contracts you'll be signing, be it with a public body or a private enterprise, that you have this evidence and that you're doing it well. And on that note, I'll leave it there, and hopefully we've got plenty of time for the questions across the topic.
Cool, thank you, Andy, and thanks to all my speakers on this subject. That was really good, really useful discussion. So we've got probably 10-15 minutes or so for questions. I've seen a couple on the chat. So let's start with them. Company with their financial year aligning with the calendar year, this is one to Ben, I'm assuming, will their first report containing disclosures be for the financial year 2023? So we're actually seeing this with the Modern Slavery Act as well, which is another kind of a non-financial reporting where government has a set reporting deadline that isn't quite aligned with financial year. So Ben, you want to come back to Avinash on that?
Yep. I think I picked up on that during my presentation, but it's for financial years beginning on or after the 6th of April 2022. So if your financial year begins on the 1st of January, the year that would be first caught by these regulations would be 1st of January 2023 to 31st of December 2023, and then you have a couple of months grace to kind of file your annual report after then. So we'd expect TCFD disclosures in your annual report in early 2024.
Cool. And the second question is from Jake, but I suspect you may have answered that, is in the chat, is the question of harmonisation. So obviously, the EU has got its sustainable taxonomy, UK's doing its own taxonomy, but we've also seen the G7 and others kind of calling for this. Is there going to be an equivalency regime where you recognise people reporting in another jurisdiction? Quite important for those global companies.
Yes, exactly. In terms of our regulations, it's important to say, by the way, that we're kind of capturing the highest point in the pyramid that's within the UK. So if your global parent company is based in the UK, all of your global operations, of course. If you've got a subsidiary, which is the kind of highest point within the UK, everything below that will be caught by our regulations.
Cool.
And you'll be expected to report on all the companies underneath you that you report on on a consolidated basis. in terms of standardized reporting, obviously non-financial reporting on sustainability issues is all kind of interconnected, but I think it's important for purposes of this to separate it out. So for TCFD, we're one of the first countries to be doing this. There is the development of the international standards under the Sustainability Standards Board, though, which the IFRS are setting up. It's not quite clear when those standards will come through. However, it's worth noting that the IFRS is setting up the Sustainability Standards Board and have a working group going on at the same time to look at what a prototype of a climate standard could look like. The current draft of that climate standard is very heavily based on TCFD. So if that international standards go through in that form, I would expect that TCFD becomes common across the countries that are endorsing those IFRS standards. So yes, on TCFD, there's a very strong basis for comparability and kind of implementation across multiple borders. In terms of the taxonomy, the EU is developing a taxonomy, Canada's developing a taxonomy, China's developing a taxonomy. There is an international platform for taxonomies, which the UK is a member of, which is looking about comparability and cross-border issues. The UK have said that we are basing our green taxonomy on the EU, but we're looking at what is appropriate for the UK. So we'll put out more detail on that later on.
Okay. I was going to put the question to the floor now. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask?
Ben, this is Jake. Can I just ask a quick follow-up on that? On the point of harmonization, I understand the notion that international standards are being developed. Is there a plan for equivalency provisions in the UK reporting? I know we've seen at least that in the EU approach to recognize equivalent reporting standards, and expecting that as these are emerging in different places, equivalency may be a helpful tool for companies that are have a multinational footprint. Is that part of the plan here as well?
So we're still considering all the feedback we had from the consultation, but to be clear, the current plan is that it will be mandatory for companies to report within, for the highest point of their company structure that is within the UK. So not providing that kind of exemption if you have a global parent overseas that is producing a TCFD report. We're considering that, though. That's something we got feedback on in the consultation.
Thank you.
Are there others? Questions? No, I've got a couple actually. But one for Helena and one for Andy actually. So I'll start with it's both kind of the implementation and the sort of side of things. So Andy, what impact has the disclosure had within Vodafone? Has there been how do you sort of measure the value of this? Are you doing it to kind of get a first mover advantage? Are investors actually asking for this? So kind of on that implementation period. I guess to Helena, you've been helping companies understand this. What would your advice be to firms who have never done this before? And how long did it take to get all the information together? I guess that applies to Vodafone as well.
Yeah, so if I start on I'd say our large investors are demanding it and expecting it. And I think as Vodafone wants to be a leader on ESG, and we see ourselves as a large global player who does a very credible, very positive kind of approach to things, then there's no way we couldn't jump on TCFD when it came out, because we wanted to show that we're doing things right and we're doing it well. And then the fact that it's becoming mandatory, just it adds weight, but we were already going to be there even if it didn't. And yeah, our main large shareholders who generally hold us for a long period of time, then TCFD makes perfect sense. They want to know that that risk is being managed, and we're doing that in an appropriate way, and they can understand that. If you're in a different organization where maybe people expect very rapid growth, so they only hold you for a short period of time, then some of the risks and opportunities won't emerge for a number of years. So maybe the drivers there are less clear. But for us, yeah, it's definitely a large push from our kind of investor stakeholders, as well as an internal just desire to do, to disclose well and have a good management over our whole business.
I don't know if Hannah, you would come back on that, especially on the kind of like how long it takes to actually collect this, and kind of any advice you have to the firms who are, have never really thought about this or reported before.
Sure. So I think the first thing that we often recommend is doing a bit of a landscaping exercise at the start. So I think, Andy, you alluded to doing a gap analysis at the start of the reporting process. And we find this is a really helpful tool. If you've never looked at it before, you have an idea of what the recommendations are, but not sure how they link to your organization. So the first step we would really say is doing that sort of gap analysis readiness assessment against the TCFD recommendations, and really understanding, for your organization where you're currently maybe doing a bit better and you have the structures and the governance in place already, but then also identifying those sort of gaps where you might need to put a bit more focus and time in to fully align to that the TCFD recommendations. So by identifying those gaps, that helps you to start to put out a bit of a roadmap and to sort of get a bit of a plan in place as to what you should be doing over the next sort of 2 or 3 years to enable that alignment. I think the other thing, just to sort of hopefully provide a bit of reassurance, is that I think we're yet to meet a company who's ticked all the boxes straight away. There's always going to be gaps. It is this long-term piece of work. So I think the most important thing is understanding where you are now, and starting to put a plan into place of where you need to be, but being transparent in the way you're reporting, acknowledging that you haven't finished. It's not that you've ticked all the boxes and you're ready to move on from it. It is something that you will continually evolve over time, and feel comfortable saying, disclosing that you are sort of working to improve it and thinking about what those next steps are.
Yeah, and if I can just add, I mean, not all data is going to be quantified, and especially with climate change, it's quite often it's not a single standalone risk. It's a risk you're already managing through various resilience kind of risk management processes, but maybe it's an accelerator, or it's something that will have an additional impact. Especially if you're thinking more the physical risk side. If it's regulation, then that's much more short term, and you're probably already engaging to a degree with upcoming expected regulation. But the data won't always be perfect. You will have quantified data that maybe is great for one place, but it isn't for elsewhere. Sea level rise or climate change modeling. Some countries give that out available free, so you know where you are in your market. Others, it isn't, so you need to make some assumptions. And then elsewhere, you'll have nothing. It'd be a purely, qualitative understanding, and that's where you have to engage with your local teams, or maybe local consultants that have a bit more of a feel for what may happen and what your company may do. But you might not be able to put a number on it yet, but maybe in 3-4 years' time you can. So there's a real blend of approach. And it's, as Helena mentioned, it's a journey that you're going to have to, progress continually.
Oh, thank you. We've got a couple of minutes left, so does anyone have any kind of final questions for any of the audience? Or if any of the participants? Nope. I got one final one for Ben, actually, kind of linked to that. Obviously, you'll be responding later on this year. What kind of guidance or next steps kind of will BEIS be doing for companies? Because I imagine there's going to be a lot of companies who this kind of, mostly we're doing our best to raise awareness of this among our membership and trying to upskill them in this area. But I mean, there is a kind of slight risk that moving very quickly to have all the obligations in place means companies won't have enough time to do a kind of thorough authoritative response. So will BEIS be doing kind of more guidance and support for companies who maybe a bit blindsided or just don't really know where to start?
Great question, Craig. So we will, of course, be putting out guidance alongside our regulations. So subject to approval by ministers, etc., etc. When we lay regulations in Parliament, we would lay additional guidance for companies alongside those. So that would be in advance of the regulations coming into force. I would say though that there are a lot of great resources out there already. You know, we've heard from EcoAct that, you know, they're providing services. There are others out there. The TCFD hub, the TCFD information hub, has a lot of guidance and information on there. And in terms of the direction of travel for businesses, so in the 2019 Green Finance Strategy, we said we expect listed companies and large asset owners to comply with TCFD by 2022. We put out a roadmap in November last year saying we're going to roll out TCFD and this is the expected population of companies. We published a consultation earlier this year. So I'm really hoping not too many people are going to get blindsided by this, but there is still time to prepare. And I think the good thing about it being internationally kind of this international set of recommendations is that they've been out there since 2017, and there's lots of kind of accompanying guidance and sometimes sector specific guidance outside alongside that. But yes, of course, government will be putting out guidance alongside its regulations and looking to support business in any way it can.
Yeah, I can say we're just there's going to be some firms who are just unaware, which is probably the case with any regulatory issue. So I think we're kind of at time now, so I'm going to wrap up now. But as I say, we'll be sharing the recording and putting it on the Climate Hub. But we've got a series of events next week I wanted to make you aware of. So on Monday, we are doing an event specifically on how to power tech firms. How can tech firms adopt renewable energies? So the issues of power purchase agreements, what sources to use, providers. On Tuesday, we're going to be looking at sort of digital tools using to basically track net zero in a transparent way, and it's going to measure yourself against targets. And on Wednesday, we'll be looking at smart retrofitting. What else got coming up? So Thursday, we're doing a briefing on the recent the recent Cabinet Office PPN, which essentially needs anyone bidding for large government contracts to disclose their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And also on Thursday, we're launching our Connected Home Report. So this is looking at kind of how the smart home market performed over the lockdowns. And I think it's particularly relevant to anyone interested in energy efficiency, because a big part of that connected home market is around energy efficiency. So yeah, thank you all for taking your time to attend this meeting. Thanks very much to Helena, Andy, and Ben for taking the time to prepare for this session. And I wish you all a very good Friday and weekend. And I'm going to close the call. So thanks very much, everyone.